Take two, everybody. Hopefully you can hear us, see us. We've changed a few things around, so I'm sure you'll let us know if you can't hear us. Welcome to Huntington. As I said before, we are of course reacting to the news that David Wagner has been sacked as Norwich City head coach earlier on Friday. Christoph Bühler has obviously left as well, and that follows a 4-0 playoff second leg defeat to Leeds United at Ellen Road last night that has meant and confirmed that Norwich City will be playing Championship football again, with all of the financial realities that entails. Kind of Southport, joined by Paddy Davitt and Samuel Seaman, to bring you a little bit of reaction to the news, to speak about obviously how we've got here, all of those various elements, and hopefully this time we'll be able and be live for significantly longer than we were last time. But hey, that's the perils of live broadcasting, isn't it? Sometimes things go wrong, and sometimes you have to change things. So that is
nobody died, Clement.
No one's died. Well, you know, I just
having a drink on a Friday afternoon.
Exactly, and we've got good people watching us and comment as well. We've got Adam behind the camera who's going to be flashing up your comments as we go, hopefully, although we'll try not to do too much technologically maybe, and reading stuff out as well. Paddy, let's get your reaction to this news then. David Wagner no longer Norwich City's head coach, given everything that's happened in the last 12, 24 hours, maybe even longer than that over the course of the season, probably comes as no real surprise.
No, I mean, we were saying, well, I was saying, nobody probably heard me, but in part one I was...
You made a brilliant best you've ever sounded.
Yeah, it probably was actually. Yeah. Well, and I won't repeat it now, but not surprised personally, because I felt, you know, without being uncharitable to him, he probably dodged a bullet late autumn, early winter period, when 7 defeats in 9, and you saw they were falling around him. You know, I think Mowbray went out of Sunderland. Was it Duff went out of Swansea around that period, and you know, both of those had actually beaten David Wagner in that spell, or beaten Norwich City in that spell. So, and we know now, we knew at the time, but we know now, there was meetings as a board internally, discussions. He came out pre-Cardiff, which was the game they were 2-1 down, going late into that game in South Wales. Adam Mina comes off the bench, not for the first time, rescued him and probably rescued that win. Then they repeated it at Bristol City. Remember the touchline jig from Wagner, Mourinho-esque, which probably underlined the pressure he felt he was under. As he said himself, his back was against the wall. Another quote I remember him talking about at the time was, it was almost like 6 weeks worth of press conferences, and it was all about his future and his, you know, status as Norwich manager. So I personally felt he was fortunate to stay in post at that spell, which is why now, as we sit here, a matter of hours after it's been confirmed he's no longer in charge, I'm not surprised. I think the speed of it is telling, because it also, to me, tells me that this has been in the pipeline. I mean, somebody said to me 2 or 3 days ago they felt, irrespective of how the playoffs resolved themselves, he wouldn't be in charge. That was the feeling internally. And the point I was just making when we got cut off previously was, I think what you can say definitively about Ben Napper, as we build a profile of how he is and how he operates, he doesn't do anything knee-jerk. That's not a word I would associate with him, his character, how he acts. He's had 6 months or so now to reflect on this, to work through what he feels, whether there was an alignment issue there, whether there was clear, and there was obviously clear areas of difference between head coach and sporting director. A head coach he inherited rather than appointed, and it's now obviously played out. The dust has settled on the season. Very disappointing end, as we know, and the time now, pretty swiftly after the end of what unfolded at Ellen Road, was right from Ben Napper's point of view, and I think that decisive act will stand everybody in good stead, because it signals that this is a guy who is, when he's absolutely certain and he feels the time is right, he will act, and he will act decisively. And now it needs to be followed by, and increasingly I'm sure this conversation will be dictated by or overtaken by who next, but that needs to happen relatively swiftly, because it is a big summer. There's the head coach situation to resolve now, then there's the huge squad turnover, both on their terms and maybe players who will leave because they don't wish to be part of it, or the financial imperative is such and the offers are too good to turn down. So at the start of what feels a big summer, and we've not even got into what might happen at board level in terms of the shifting plates between the old ownership and maybe the newer force emerging around Mark Attanasio and his group. All of these strands need to be pulled together very swiftly to give Norwich the best opportunity to really engender a degree of optimism now, bring the fan base with them on a journey, not dissimilar maybe to when Farker and Webber first came in, and that felt new and different and ahead of the curve. They need to try and engender those feelings again going into this period of the close season. But then obviously when we get round to August and the Championship ranges into view again, you need to feel that, okay, this is now definitively different. This isn't more of the same. This isn't tried and trusted. This isn't tired and stale. This is exciting and something that fans want to be a part of.
Yeah, indeed. And Paddy's going to get up Ben Napper's quotes for me because both of my phones have died, I'm afraid. But Sam, I'm interested in terms of the decision itself. And Paddy made a good point there about Ben Napper and maybe the perception that's crept in of him. I think probably mostly unfairly that he's, this guy who maybe doesn't speak and doesn't take decisions and all of that stuff, when actually there clearly has been a calculated and considered move. And that's actually reflected in the quotes, which Paddy has just thrust in front of me. This via the club's official channels, of course. In the statement to confirm David Wagner's departure, Ben Napper said, David has operated with class and dignity throughout his period as Norwich City head coach, but we now feel the time is right for us to move in a different direction, and that would point to maybe the alignment point that you spoke about. We remain committed to progressing our football club in both the short and long term, working through a diligent and thorough strategy. The appointment of a new head coach is an important one. We'll now work and continue our due diligence. That's a hard word to say after a Diet Coke, and it is a Diet Coke, by the way, just to clarify. With the view of making the appointment in the near future. But I want to pick up on that word, Sam, continue. This is clearly a process which has already begun and has already been going on. As Paddy says, it's not a knee-jerk reaction to what happened at Ellen Road last night. We think that this probably would have been the outcome irrespective of how it ended, be it a noble 1-0 defeat, be it maybe even a Wembley defeat, maybe even be it promotion to the Premier League. So in terms of statements of intent and the quickness of this decision being made, it needed to happen, didn't it, for that sort of sense of renewal and change that Paddy spoke about?
Yeah, I think it did, and I think Napper's chosen his words quite carefully there, because it maybe is a lesson in patience and the importance of that, because after all, aside from those sort of rocky first couple of months after Napper arrived at the club, to be honest, results-wise, it has been going pretty well, and obviously Norwich did get to the playoffs before sort of embarrassing themselves last night, unfortunately. So I think it is the sort of situation that he would have been building up to for a long time, but unfortunately he can't really show any signs of that, because, I mean, what are you going to do, come out and say, yeah, I don't want my head coach? I think as far as motivation goes, that probably would have killed any of it for David Wagner. So yeah, I think it's good to see such decisive change, and it's definitely important that it's happening now, because last night I went out and spoke to fans about how they felt after that game, and immediately the focus was on change. It wasn't even really bashing the team for the performance on the night or being angry about that. It was instantly, we want to see change in the summer, we want to see new players, fresh blood, new manager, all of those sorts of things. And after such a miserable night at Ellen Road, I think Norwich really did need to do something quickly. And, as you said, there has been this perception of Napper maybe being slightly ponderous in his decision making, but apart from when he first arrived, and as he said at the time, we wanted a bit of time to sort of get bedded in. But from January onwards, there wasn't really a good time to get rid of David Wagner, and it probably for the rest of the season would have been the wrong decision. So I think he's moved as quickly as he could, and that spells probably good news for Norwich and excitement for their fans, because after such a terrible ending to the season and everything grinding to a halt so quickly, and going from excitement and potential 90 minutes from Wembley to such abject failure at Ellen Road, they really needed something to turn that dial as quickly as possible. And even though I'm sure we'll see evidence of further change in the coming days, that is the biggest possible change that you can make really in the footballing department. And I think everyone knows now, and it was a signal of intent, that Norwich are going in a different direction, and given where that direction was going previously, I think that's only good news, and fans will love that.
Yeah, and this probably bleeds into the conversation in terms of what and who, I guess, specifically comes next, and that the fact that he didn't make that decision early on, when and then post January, I think if you're making it, you're then looking at probably an interim option to the end of the season. So are you then better placed just to keep David Wagner anyway? I remember someone saying to me in the autumn that for what the squad was, which was an older, experienced group, he was probably the best place to lead it. And that coupled with obviously the shift in recruitment strategy. And I think we've said pretty consistently, even in those dark periods, even in that 7 defeats in 9 in autumn, that playing group has been playing for him, have been fully behind him and his ideas. So to then make that decision, do you then kill any chance of getting into the playoffs? And of course, maybe this is a change, and change more generally is easier when you're kind of bankrolled by Premier League cash. So whilst that option was always on the table, the form was good, and we've referenced as well the extraordinary turnaround, which was excellent. And of course, you have to also add the context that he was the head coach, and they were the group of players that got the club into 17th anyway, with obviously injury mitigation around that. It was an unbelievable turnaround, 15 unbeaten at home. But Paddy, I guess this bleeds into maybe the issues that he had throughout his tenure. And I mean, you look at the numbers, pretty average, to be honest, in true. 75 matches in charge since obviously succeeding Dean Smith as head coach in January 2023. 31 wins, 17 draws, 27 defeats, a win percentage rate of 41%. But this feeling that's been around him, even probably begun in that autumn period, maybe even if you go back, probably the moment that Stuart Webber announced that he was set to depart as sporting director. There has been this feeling of kind of temporariness, I guess, around David Wagner, that he struggled to shift, and also he came in and he was dealt a really tough hand. I think we can say that the state the club was in, not just in terms of on the pitch, but in terms of off-field relations, in terms of where the fan base were at, and the connection that they were feeling. He has come and attempted, successfully or unsuccessfully, is probably up for debate, but he has tried to repair some of those. And I think dignity that Ben Napper used, dignity and class that Ben Napper used, I think they're probably the words that you would associate with David Wagner on a human level. But from a footballing side, the fans haven't really connected with his style of play, and it all has bled into this feeling of probably short-termism that's existed around him for a significant period of time that he's really struggled to shake off.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this, and it's pertinent again because who was facing him in the opposing dugout on Thursday night, but somebody who's very well known to Norwich fans and who did have that swashbuckling, attacking, pleasing on the eye style that we've discussed this in the past. And for me, Wagner was very much a pragmatist, whereas Farke was very philosophical and a purist almost. And you could argue maybe he's refined his approach a little bit because he's had a few bruises and knocks now, starting with the way he was dispensed with at Norwich, but still much more pleasing on the eye, I think, their style of football. And you saw again when they cut loose, aided, obviously, and abetted by how poor Norwich were defensively on Thursday night. But the fluidity of movement, the pace, the directness, the everything at pace, whereas, with Norwich, it just felt like painting by numbers too often for me, and very ponderous. And it's hard to get away from what they did last summer, which is they, i.e., him and the previous sporting director, had decided that they needed to go. Mentality was the word, but that translated into an Ashley Barnes, a Shane Duffy, less so a Jack Stacey, but Danny Bartlett came in January. That's not a type of player, and that isn't to single those out necessarily individually, but what it said was that it was going to be almost this was now a last roll of the dice, and that you had an ageing squad. And one of the first public pronouncements from Ben Napper in November, we need to lower the age profile, and you will see that now very much as we move into the summer transfer window. So it was almost the last roll of the dice, I think, under Wagner, and that was what everything in last summer's recruitment was geared towards. And he might turn around and say, well, even allowing for all the hurdles he had to overcome, both in terms of what was directed at him on a personal level that he had to shoulder and come through, the injuries, notably to Josh Sargent for 4 months, and what a huge miss he was. If you look at where they were tracking prior to his injury, and then when he came back in January, where they were, but really, that to get to top 6 may have been the stated objective. But I think you had a right to expect a bit more than what they served up at Leeds. Really, yes, Leeds are probably 17 points better in the table, tells you definitively they had better players, arguably had a better head coach, and had a better system as well, clearly. But were Norwich that inferior to Leeds? Not on the evidence of what we saw in the first game on Sunday, albeit you'd have liked far more in terms of attacking threat. But last night was a chasm, and it was embarrassing, really. If you're a Norwich player, to be part of that or a head coach or his staff was embarrassing. It was abject, and it was a surrender. It was an abdication. Let down all those travelling supporters, let down all those fans who, while many have had their doubts during the course of the season, but had come back firmly, down the stretch. Those atmospheres against Ipswich, Leeds in the first leg on Sunday, really, really felt like Wagner had managed to unify the group again. But those fault lines and those fractures which we saw burst and rupture, round the turn of the autumn-winter period, the Watford home game with his in-game substitutions in February and the reaction to that, they were under the surface. They were still there. They haven't gone away. And
it felt to me a little bit like, you've got a divorcing mum and dad, and there's a child in the middle, and both sides just agree to call the truce. So that's kind of what it felt like to try, get the child through their exams. Absolutely. It's kind of how it felt like to me. And it's interesting. You referenced him post-match. I'll read you a few quotes from him last night, and I agree. I don't think to me, and I only saw him when Chris Gorham was interviewing in the mix zone. I felt he looked not broken like he did at Sunderland, but I just thought he looked shattered, to be honest.
He used the word exotic.
Yeah, he does. And I'll read the quote now. So this is what he said when he was asked directly by Paddy about his future, and he said, "I think it's clear that there has to be some conversations from my side as well about the plans for next season. It's an exhausting season. This is the truth. A very strange season, even for me as an experienced manager. It is not a normal season. You always reflect at the end of every season. Everything that has happened was more or less for me clear to see the reasons why. Unfortunately, the fairy tale could not happen at the end. Is it a low? Absolutely, it is. But it's life and it's football. You have some downs, you have some ups as well. Not only in the game, not only in the season, but over a longer period." And that panned out to be his final words in post. And of course, you can watch that final press conference on our YouTube channel now. We're going to come to Adam in a moment just for some of your comments and thoughts. And of course, if you haven't got them in, do get them in on whatever platform you're watching, and we'll try and bring them into the conversation. But even in that statement, Sam, he speaks about the strangeness of this season. And I think, I felt it for a while, just really bizarre. When you think about, particularly 2024 is a good example, right? So they, we mentioned incredible home records, some brilliant individual goals scored, some, and Paddy listed a few, some really real high moments. That win against Ipswich at Carrow Road, the win against Preston recently. These are two recent examples. You can stretch back. Wins over Coventry, West Brom, Hull in that January period, which kind of hinted to a more bigger turnaround. And yet, it's United's maybe a good word. It's never quite felt like it's got going for him at Norwich City. It's never really felt like he's been able to turn the tide in his favour.
Yeah, it's interesting you asked me about that, because I've literally just been writing about it in my piece about Wagner, and I said it feels like this season's been a bit of a dream, and I think part of that is because in so many ways this has been completely different to what we know Norwich City as, and the sort of players that they sign, the coaches that tend to do well, and the culture that there is around the club usually when it's succeeding and when it's at its best and it feels the most like Norwich City. I think they have gone away from those principles a little bit, and I think for the short term, given where they were, fans were reeling from two pretty embarrassing Premier League campaigns. There had been this really long-term narrative of Norwich being too nice and not having enough experience and struggling with mentality and things like that, and for that reason I think there probably was quite a large section of the fan base that was willing to embrace a lot of the ideals that Wagner brought to the table in terms of wanting experience, focusing a lot on mentality rather than necessarily as much on sort of technical ability and maybe tactics as well. So I think he actually came at the right time for his ideas to sort of seep into the club and to define the club for a bit, but after a while it starts to feel really quite different to what Norwich City actually is. And I remember last summer, especially with the sorts of players that they're signing, for me, seeing sort of Ashley Barnes in a Norwich shirt for the first time did feel a bit strange. The likes of him and Shea Duffy and Danny Barton, these sorts of players aren't the likes that Norwich have really signed for a very long time now, and it's not the sort of approach that they've taken. So I think the reason why it feels like it's in such a strange bubble is because even those good moments have come in a slightly different way and have felt slightly different to what they have in the last few years. And I think to sort of move things forward, what Napper's next appointment will do, I think, based on his own principles and what he's talked about it probably will bring things a little bit closer to what Norwich fans are used to, and it will be back to maybe the old rhythm. But of course, that isn't always successful. We saw that in the first season of Daniel Farke's tenure. But I think it will start to feel a bit more normal and a bit more like Norwich if they can slowly get things over towards this younger age profile. Probably a coach who is less of a big name and has less experience at the higher level, but maybe is more focused on an entertaining brand of football and a little bit more control in games. So I think it will start to feel a bit less strange, but because there are so many of these juxtaposing elements that maybe don't feel much like we've seen from the club before, I think that's part of why it's felt like such a sort of strange, dreamy season, to be honest.
Yes, indeed. Adam, can you bring us and read us some comments from the fine people watching?
I can. So Shaney NCFC on YouTube saying, lads, do you feel Wagner would have been parted ways with whether we got promoted or not?
Oh yeah. I think we're probably all in agreement that would have taken place purely on maybe the point of alignment, which I think is the one that probably strikes out. And you've seen that, to be fair, Paddy, at points like after Sheffield Wednesday and as recently as Birmingham, where he spoke about it. He was very quick to praise Stuart Webber. There was no mention of Ben Napper in those quotes. Sheffield Wednesday as well. He was pretty honest and pretty pointed about where he felt the squad was at. Then you've got maybe less so of the worded examples and more of the physical examples. Sidney van Hooijdonk as a case study over the last 6 months. He's been reluctant to use them, and that is a player that Ben Napper, if he didn't identify, definitely took the steps to sign. So I think throughout the last 2-3 months there have been splits, I would say, and pretty obvious splits publicly.
Yeah, I mean, and for me, it started around the end of the January window, just prior to Poeta leaving, and he was very clearly, I've been told, we almost have to get rid to balance books or to recalibrate, because the finances are such that carrying players like him and Forshaw, who aren't going to get huge amounts of starting minutes, wasn't an option. But that was very much a one-way. You could tell that was very much a one-way conversation. You assume delivered from Napper towards Wagner, which he didn't agree with, and that was where he was going. I think after the Sheffield Wednesday game, when they obviously picked up another injury for Gibbs, didn't they? They had John Rowe out at that stage, and he again returned to the subject of squad depth and how he'd warned in January almost, which you'd have to be a genius. Who's he warning? He's warning Ben Napper, and he's doing it in a very public setting. So, and the Birmingham one, I mean, to me, that was the watershed moment when you airbrush out your current boss and you refer to your previous boss, one of your closest friends in football, and how you together as a partnership had engineered the top six. It struck me as a man who probably knew the writing was on the wall, and he will go on his terms, kind of thing. So, and even last night, so I said it after the presser, for him to use that opportunity to thank everybody connected to the club for 10 months of hard work, albeit they fell down at the final hurdle, but it did feel very much of a swan song and getting ahead of the curve. So I think he's an experienced head coach. He would have known very clearly that
he'd have had a sense.
He's not Napper's man in the mid to longer term, and that all that was keeping him in post really was the progress of Norwich through the season into the playoffs and then all the way through. But even that, to answer the question, I don't think would have saved him. It would have been quite a call as he was held aloft at Wembley with the Championship playoff trophy to say you don't need to worry about the Premier League, David. But that seems to have been the sense you get from speaking to people that it might have played out that way. But I guess it had played out that way, his stock would have been sufficiently high that he'd have had no problem. And it'd be just as an aside, I'm interested now where he goes. Who takes him? What level? Is it still in England? Is it in the Championship? Will we see him again very swiftly in an opposing dugout? So that's an intriguing one. I mean, separating out everything we've discussed from a very forensic Norwich perspective, if you're outside of the Norwich bubble, you're looking at a guy who's got a team into the playoffs. Hull didn't make it, Coventry didn't make it, Sunderland, Middlesbrough. That's not a bad achievement, looking at it from afar. So I don't think he'll be short of potential opportunities. Yeah, it's interesting. I've already seen some of the external reaction on social media, which is a bit like shocking. Like, what more did people want from him? But again, this is people who aren't inside the bubble, who haven't watched Norwich maybe at all, making those type of judgments. I agree. It's going to be really interesting to see where he ends up. I personally feel, having seen how this season has panned out, I think he could probably do with a holiday more than anything else, and I'm not going to advise him as to how long that should be, but it feels like the next role for him is a big one after
really what's happened at Schalke, Young Boys, and now Norwich as well. Adam, back to the comments. What else we got? Let's get through a few.
So NCFC Finley 17 on YouTube saying thoughts on Pelash, Clement, and Hughes staying on. Is this because they were club appointments?
Oh, interesting one, Sam. What's your view on that?
I think you have to separate it out probably between the three of them. Clements is a goalkeeping coach, and you don't tend to see as much turnover with them as you do with sort of other coaches. It seems to be a bit less of a sort of ideological position than maybe the other ones are, and maybe head coaches don't feel they need as much sort of chemistry with the goalkeeper coach. So I think that's a bit common. Hughes, for me, strikes me as
he's done a bit more around set pieces, hasn't he? This year, that seems to be where he's sort of led.
And it's also worked, to be fair to him.
Yeah.
And I think he can also he's worked in various roles in football.
He's done loads. He's been in academies as well, I think, previously. So maybe there's an opportunity for him elsewhere in the club.
That might be a bit of a pending situation. And then Pelash, we were actually speaking about it earlier. At Huddersfield, he stayed under. It was at least 3 managers, wasn't it?
Yeah, Corberan, Schofield, Fotheringham, Warnock.
Yeah. So a good few.
Yeah.
And he's clearly somebody who's rated very, very highly. And I think he's somebody who a new head coach is going to want to look at, because, I mean, anyone that's even seen that interview you did with him pretty quickly after he arrived at the club will be impressed with his knowledge of football, his passion, and the way that he talked about it. So I think, you know, every head coach has their own way of doing things, and it's still very possible that none of those three are at the club, you know, 2 weeks after the new head coach arrives. But I think for different reasons, probably Ben Napper wanted to wait on that decision, or those decisions, until they had a new head coach. And for me, if it was down to me, I would want to keep certainly Pelash at least around it, because he looks like a really impressive individual who can sort of fit in with any sort of setup and any framework. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops, but I don't think it's a situation that's completely done yet.
Yeah, I remember Frankie McAvoy was at Daniel Farker for the first couple of Daniel Farker's pre-season games, wasn't he, before then eventually leaving to join Alex Neil. You obviously had Mike Phelan as well, between Neil Adams and Alex Neil, whose name I said 2 seconds ago, so why that went, I don't know. So that there are examples of this, and I guess it's as you map out, it will be largely dependent on the head coach, the entourage that he brings, and maybe the dynamic as to how that plays out, and probably the type of profile that it is as well, which we'll get into in the second half. Back to you, Adam.
Tony Snooker fan on YouTube saying, I wasn't a Wagner fan, way too negative, sideways football and backwards. Do you think Norwich will get Carlos Cuesta? There's lots of sort of Carlos Cuesta-esque questions and comments. Is that maybe someone of interest?
Yeah, we'll hold on to those, because I think we're going to come on to those in the second half in a moment. I just wanted to round off the Wagner chat, and so I will come back to who's it?
There's Liam and Tony, I think.
Yeah, we'll come back to the Carlos Cuesta comments in a moment. But Paddy, just to finish on David Wagner, two points really. I mean, obviously you probably dealt with him in closer quarters than any of us. Well, you and Adam really in closer quarters than any of us. So a word on him as a human being and what he's been like to deal with, maybe compared to other managers. And then secondly, which is maybe a tougher question, what do you think his legacy is going to be at Norwich City? How do you think he's going to be remembered as the head coach?
That's difficult at this stage, legacy-wise. He leaves a more positive and favourable impression than Dean Smith did. I know that for certain, both from a media perspective and in terms of maybe what the incumbent inherits. But again, that's all a state of flux, because who knows what the squad looks like when they come back for the first day of pre-season. I generally am not sure on the legacy, because he picked them up when they were just outside the playoffs, or they just inside when Smith departed, and he leaves them just inside the playoffs with the 13th place in between. So it feels like a holding pattern to me. There's certainly no further forward in that quest to get back to the Premier League, and it's a big job. I mean, he said himself last night when maybe he still retained the glimmer that he would be tasked with next season, that it's a massive job. So has he advanced the cause in terms of moving this club back towards what they were in recent times? It's hard to say he has, really, but probably not fair just to pin all that on him, because there has been that flux both in the boardroom increasingly now in terms of the first signs of some real shifting direction of travel in terms of ownership. We've had a sporting director change around him as well. all of that has been quite destabilising. And I think that's probably where the comments came from about such an exhausting season on the personal level, really challenging. So you do have to add that mitigation, but
his beard's definitely got greyer. That's what
but to deal with, to take the first part of that, I mean, I mean, we've had our moments. There was me and Adam were invited for a chat in his office just after the Coventry home game, where if you probably don't recall now, but the sexy football comments which he'd come out with pre-match and got misinterpreted, and maybe there was a feeling that was us who had done that. I don't think it was, and that was our point. But my reasoning for mentioning that is it wasn't as I had back in the day with Alex Neil, a bit of a hairdryer treatment, and I feared the Glasgow kiss. It was more, look, we've got a good relationship. I think we've worked well together. I just want to hear your side of it. You know, it's very calm, very measured. It was all, you know, in his office at Colney, so you know, it gave me a sense of the man that, you know, maybe. And he said like he wasn't overly fussed about it, but it put him in an awkward spot, and he'd had to apologise to Robbins post-match for the misunderstanding. I mean, they won the game, thankfully. Otherwise, he might have had a different approach. Yeah. But just as an example, in terms of the personality of the guy, and that's just in the media sense. I mean, I think you got a real sense of that Watford watershed game where he came out and it was strong. It wasn't. It was, you don't support us, you don't support me, don't come. And I think days afterwards he said he was probably too strong, but it did convey the passion, the feeling he had for the place, for that group of players. And I think, and I can't speak from a fan's perspective, but I'm sure that on a human level there was a connection with the fan base, even if they didn't really buy into his methods, didn't like his style of football, felt it was a bit of a grind compared to, you know, previous incumbents. But I don't think you could argue that as an individual he did try and build bridges, whereas, you know, Dean Smith clearly was not of that mind. And he talked about, I'm not Farker, I can't be Farker. You remember those comments? I'm not necessarily saying Wagner was cut from the same cloth as Farker, but I think he understood, and the empathy that he showed to the fan base was there. And when it was good, there was a connection with the fan base. When it was good, you know, at the start of his reign and those good moments this season, but that isn't enough, is it? It's not enough to have that personal connection with the fan base. You need to bring them on a journey and get them to believe in what you're trying to do by showing them on the pitch week in, week out. And I don't think we saw enough of that consistently.
Yeah, and I think maybe just as a fit, really, in terms of football-wise, and Chris Sutton was part of Sky Sports' team last night, and obviously I'm sure people have seen or read on our sites his analysis of it, which I thought was very difficult to argue with, in terms of even down to, you could even pinpoint last night as an example, Borja Sainz on the bench just in case it goes to extra time. That almost, you know, I don't want to say negative because that's probably unfair, but that uber conservative mentality. I mean, obviously you have to go back to QPR at home and how they played at Leicester, particularly Southampton, and squandering so much of the ball. That's just not what Norwich City have been about, particularly when they embarked on this sort of bold new era under Stuart Webber in 2017, and they wanted to be more possession-based and more attractive. And then obviously we've got maybe the issues with young players and whatnot as well. So yeah, I think that you can split this, and it can be nuanced, and you can look at the human side and the football side, and say on a human level, as a bloke, and he's obviously had, you know, family issues to deal with in recent months as well with his wife. He's conducted himself with real integrity, and can certainly leave Norwich City with his head held high. It's going to be interesting to see where he ends up next, which leads us on to the second part, and I'm sure the part that everyone's itching for us to get onto, which is what's next. So Paddy, I'm just going to ask you, because this is where we always start with these things, to bring up some early bookmakers odds for me about favourites.
I've had about 15 emails in my inbox.
Yeah, I suspected you might.
Try this one, mate.
Okay, so this is what we've got at the moment. Just some names in the frame, and I think I'm not going to read the odds out because they're probably different in different places. But I'd say the similar names are about at the moment. Will Still is high up, obviously formerly of Rem, and everyone will, I'm sure, know him, and all of the furore and hype that's been around him on social media. Liam Rossigna as well, someone who has been in the conversation. Obviously left Hull relatively recently, a team that were competing with Norwich for the majority of the season for a top 6 spot. Arsenal assistant Carlos Cuesta also is featured, and there's been plenty of reports around him since probably the middle of the year. Alex Neil's on this list that I'm looking at, dear me. Steve Cooper as well. I know he's been mentioned in a few of the national media reports as well. And then obviously you get the usuals thrown in. Mark Robbins, I've seen Danny Royal mentioned as well. Of course, very, very early odds, and you can't read anything into them. But in terms of profile of appointment, Sam, and hire, and we spoke about this a little bit. We did an Instagram live earlier. It feels now that Norwich have kind of, and even though Smith and Wagner were very different personalities, football-wise, even their outlooks on the game, in terms of CVs, in terms of what had gone before in their careers, and where they're at age-wise and life-wise, quite similar profiles. When you get a couple of those, it then feels like you have a fan base that is yearning to go in a more younger, progressive direction. And from what we know about Ben Napper is he likes to work with younger coaches. So I'm not going to pin you down to a name, obviously, because that would be ridiculous. But Will Steele, Liam Rossignol, those type of profiles, is that the type of profile that you can see Norwich City going for the next head coach?
Yeah, I think the first odds we saw this morning included Steve Bruce and Sam Allardyce. I don't think it's going to be anybody of that type. I think it will be, as you said, a sort of progressive coach, probably someone that doesn't have the same sort of recognisable name that maybe Smith and Wagner had from their times coaching in the Premier League. I don't think it's necessarily guaranteed to be somebody who's been a head coach or a manager before either, which I think actually suits Norwich really well. And basically every time I've been asked, and this is usually in the Q&As, I can't remember the last time I wasn't asked in a Q&A who Norwich's next manager should be, and every time I just say I hope it's somebody I've never heard of. And although I'm not sure it will definitely be somebody I've never heard of, I think it will be a slightly more obscure name, and I think that's something that Norwich fans will look forward to. As you said, when things go wrong, people tend to want to lurch in the opposite direction, and that sort of is what happened with Dean Smith after two relegations with Daniel Farke.
Yeah, and equally, you can have a couple of progressives, and maybe there was a bit more of a yearn for this post-Farke, and probably ended up being the way that Norwich went. When you have someone like that, you want to go in a more experienced direction. So it seems to work in sort of cycles.
I think we're now in the sort of young coach era, and hopefully it actually ends up being in a position where they do so well that they go and move on to a better club, and Norwich try and replicate that appointment after that, because I think, as I said, those coaches that are up and coming have always tended to do better with Norwich. I honestly can't name a manager that's been higher than Norwich before, come down and done well for the club, because it just hasn't really worked out for them in that sense. So I think the names around at the moment are kind of exciting. Hopefully the football will be a little bit more positive as well, because Norwich fans have been pretty clear that that's what they wanted. But I mean, Steve Cooper, seeing that name did sort of throw a bit of a spanner in the works, because it's been widely reported that he's somebody, even though he maybe isn't likely to come to Norwich, he's been widely reported as somebody who Ben Napper was interested in. And I thought, footballing wise, that's not quite the style of football that I think Norwich fans would have in mind when they picture Ben Napper's ideals. So I'm not sure it's completely nailed on, but the way that he's spoken, he'll obviously want a younger coach and somebody who is maybe more of a coach than a manager. We were speaking about this earlier. I think Wagner is definitely a manager who wants players to come to him, and he wants to control certain elements. He wants to have a huge say in transfers. And I think the way that younger coaches are now, they don't expect that, and they don't maybe necessarily want that. They want to be able to focus on tactics and how to get the best out of the players that they have, rather than spending their time divided across all departments trying to manage a lot of things. And I also think with the sorts of players that Napper wants to bring in, which, as he said, is younger and trying to lower that squad profile, younger players now are more used to coaches than managers. Whereas you've got, Ashley Barnes, who worked under Sean Dyche, maybe the most manager there is about in the current game, and all those other experienced players will be used to working under those sorts of coaches. The younger players that Napper will want to bring in will be used to working with head coaches rather than managers. So I think all of that together means it is likely to be the sort of coach that I think everyone was expecting from Napper. And I think, to be honest, the large majority of Norwich fans will be pretty pleased with it.
Adam, I'm sure in terms of comments there are lots of names coming through. You already mentioned Carlos Cuesta, and I'll put his name to Paddy in a moment. But just give us a flavour and a feel in terms of some of the names that people are suggesting across the various platforms this afternoon.
So we've got Russell Martin when he gets sacked from Southampton losing to Leeds. Henrik Rydstrom at Malmo FF from Joachim, which I believe he's
Swedish based. Yeah.
So that's
a nice niche shout.
Tuchel and Mourinho are available from Johnny Free Speech. Stephen Naismith also mentioned by NCFC Finley. Jack Wilshere, which I think someone who's maybe been mentioned in the past. He's coming up a few times on here. Roy Hodgson from Liam Winnell. Wayne Rooney showing as one of the favourites. Hope not from Mark Weston. Get Mike Bassett back from Uncle Mort. Rosenior seems to be quite a sort of familiar theme. There's plenty of kind of managers, I suppose, of different backgrounds. Knutson as well, just being revisited, I suppose, for a few people. Hear it in the comments section. So yeah, plenty of names being thrown around.
Okay, interesting. I'm going to chuck two at you then, Paddy. Then I think maybe I'll come to Sam with Liam Rosenior. Will Still and Carlos Cuesta. These are two managers that Ben Napper knows and has relationships with. Lots of stories about Cuesta throughout this season, really. Obviously, there were plenty of reports. When was that? About February time, was it? I think my calendar's a bit skew with about them holding talks with him in the winter and him wanting to see out the season with Arsenal. Obviously, Mikel Arteta's assistant manager at the moment. And it's worth noting as well, there's been a report by John Percy in the Telegraph saying that he's not under consideration for the Norwich role, which is an interesting snippet. It's not one that we've heard ourselves, but that's one that is being reported. Those two specifically, I guess they feed into maybe the profile dynamic that we're speaking about. And you think about the Championship managers that have done well this season: Maresca, McKenna, Farker, maybe to an extent, but I think he's maybe slightly beyond it. But Russell Martin, you probably throw in that category. Rosenior in that category as well. They're all a certain profile. Will Still and Carlos Cuesta, those two names, what do you make of those?
Well, I mean, it's very obvious why they would be mentioned and
we'll tell us
quite highly.
Just on Will Still, because people may not be aware. Tell us about the link with Napper there is there.
Well, basically, Ben Napper previously Arsenal loans manager and would have been very pivotal in former Arsenal player Folarin Balogun, who went and had an unbelievable season, young striker with Will Still at Ream, and Will Still's brother is also involved with him as well.
It's number two.
Yeah, a little bit like the Cowleys as well, more closer to home. So, was it you were telling me that to the point where he was obviously Ben Napper would have been going over to France and keeping an eye on Balogun and staying with the Stills? I mean, we don't have that, we can't verify that, but that was the sense. But setting aside where he was staying when he was in France, there clearly was a very close relationship. And that was a hugely successful spell for Balogun because he got a massive move to Monaco thereafter. And that's where Still first came to prominence, wasn't it? About this young Belgian-born but to English parents coach who come from this, and I've seen him downplay it subsequently, the football manager background. That
what's wrong with that? What's all this about?
From one FM to another, yeah. But in the sense that I think he's subsequently tried to distance himself, saying, well, I've been around coaching for 10 years and I might have come up a little bit on that background, but I actually know the game from the coaching perspective and the scouting perspective and analysis, which is, certainly the analysis side is Ben Napper's background. So you could see, going back to the discussion we've had about Wagner, lack of, there would seem to be alignment between them, their age profile as well. Ben Napper, very young in terms of the role he's doing. He's been given an opportunity. Maybe he sees that in what he wants to do with coaches, give a young, upwardly mobile coach an opportunity, certainly one who's aligned, who he has a previous relationship with, which is what spans them with Cuesta. His 13 years or so at Arsenal, Cuesta's came in, quite an unbelievable backstory. I think he's only still in his late 20s, was a player in the Balearics over in Spain with Marco Asensio, but was never going to get, in his view, if you've looked into his background, he's done interviews and said he knew he was only going to be a very lower level player in Spain. So he embarked on coaching. Was it Juventus? No, it was a team. There was a Spanish team as well. Was it one of the Madrids? I think he was attached to. I think it was Atletico. Yeah, so unbelievable clubs on his coaching CV at such a young age. I think he was
a bit McKenna-esque, isn't it?
Yeah, the Arteta link came when he went on study visits to Man City, when Arteta was an assistant there to Guardiola, and that connection. And then Arteta obviously saw something in him, brought him into his coaching team at Arsenal. By all accounts, he's been very good at personal one-to-one development with players like Saka,
Is it 8 languages he speaks as well?
It's quite a story. And then bringing that right up to date, there was talk in the January period that, unsurprisingly, he is very ambitious and sees himself maybe in a McKenna sense of embarking on his own coaching career, and he's looking for opportunities. And if that's the case with his pedigree, and okay, Arsenal might miss out again this weekend on another title, but he's been an intrinsic part in that transformation under Arteta at Arsenal. He's clearly got something about him. If he is now looking to take his own steps on the managerial coaching ladder, and you have that Ben Napper connection, yes, why wouldn't you look at him? And, as you say, Connor, from what we led to believe, that there has been maybe exploratory discussions at various points this season with both of those camps, and going back to Still, 2-3 weeks ago he leaves Rennes by mutual consent, so he is now a free agent. So there's no strands to unpick in terms of he's with a club, the financial element, contractual element. He is ready to go if they wanted to go that route.
And he's also said he wants a championship.
Yeah, he wants to come back to England now, and he wants to manage in England. So you can see why the planets are aligning. And with Cuesta, maybe his future will become more apparent after the weekend when the Premier League season concludes. Clearly not going to be anything this side of Arsenal's game on Sunday. But yeah, I can see why those two would be deemed the front runners, because there's a lot about their backstories that aligns with Napper, both in terms of the interpersonal relationships, but also maybe their footballing philosophies. But we've done enough of these managerial cycles that there's always left field names that come out of the woodwork. So we won't nail our colours completely to the mast. But would I be surprised if, in short order, Still or Cuesta are unveiled? Absolutely not.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember a video we did about Frank Lampard a couple of cycles ago, and there were reports, which, to be fair, we never said that was going to happen, but it just goes to show how quickly these can change. And obviously, these are very, very, very early bookmakers' odds, and they are just bookmakers' odds. But it's always interesting, I think, to get a feel for the profile of candidate that is, or profile of coach that maybe externally is being viewed as what Norwich City are looking for.
All I would say, Connor, sorry to cut across you there, but some of those names, whether it's Hodgson, whether it's Alex Neil, whether it's even Mark Roberts, Steve Bruce, you can completely discount them purely on Ben Napper's quotes today in that club statement. We're going in a different direction. So anything that is resembling David Wagner, both in terms of maybe his profile, his experience as a coach, his outlook, disregard, because that doesn't chime with Ben Napper's quotes. This is a different method of travel now.
Any more names, Adam, before we...
we've got a few thrown in. Chris Lacey going for Fabian Herzerla from St. Pauli.
He's about to get promoted to the Bundesliga, I think.
It's turned into a competition.
Chris is going for Diego Martinez, would be a good shout. Done a good job with Granada. Jameson makes a good point. Will Still is a data man. He's created a team that rinses their supposed superiors. A good gamble, I would say. A few people mentioned the Potter and Napper relationship. I think
he's just turned down Ajax. Yeah. I think he might have his eyes on something a little bit bigger than that.
A few people making the point that Will Still have his licences to avoid getting fined every match, but I think he has.
He is enrolled on the pro licence course. He might even have done it by now. So that meme is dead, I'm afraid.
And a few people mentioning Kieran McKenna coming to the bigger side in East Anglia, come and give it a crack. So yeah.
Okay. Sam, the other name that has come out, and I guess this is probably unsurprising, given the job that he's done at Hull. I think he was ruled out, I think, of the Plymouth job a couple of days ago. I think he's going to be a name that, when there's a championship job, Liam Rosenior's name is going to be pushed pretty close to the queue. And if you're someone around him, you can understand why, because irrespective of maybe his post-match views, which maybe rubbed Norwich fans up the wrong way, he has done, externally looking back from it, a pretty good job at Hull, and he probably does fit the type of profile that we're talking about, albeit he's a little bit different to Still and Cuesta, because obviously he has had managerial spells at Derby, at Hull now as well. What do you make of him as a name that has been put in the frame, again, to reiterate, at this very, very, very early stage?
I really like him personally. I remember actually speaking to him when he was just a coach at Derby and thinking...
When he was a wee pup.
Yeah, and I was even more wee. I was still 18 or something. But I think he's somebody that really impresses me. And just on a personal level, if I had to choose, I'm not sure he would be absolutely top of my list. But if you put that on the table now and said, is that a good appointment for Norwich? I would think so. And it's not for me just as simple as any old championship club, and you're right that any championship club where a job comes up, he will be linked. But I think with Norwich there are probably multiple elements that would work. His style of football for me, and I know there were some complaints about that at Hull, but I think that was more to do with the tempo and the end result of it than the sort of intention, which was...
He is one of these process-driven coaches, which is Russell Martin, maybe a similar sort of coach.
Yeah, that likes possession and likes to control games, and control was that big word that Napa used quite a lot early on in his tenure. So I think from a sort of style of football point of view and the way that he's acquitted himself, he would work, but it is just one of those that feels slightly too obvious in a way, because he's just lost his job at the club that finished one place below Norwich.
It's a little bit Dean Smith, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose.
Yes
so.
and no.
But for me, it feels like it would be a step up, and I suppose I would say that as somebody who has followed Norwich for so long. But for me, it does feel like Hull to Norwich at the moment is a minor step up, especially given he's just lost his job at Hull. So it's definitely not something I would be against, but it does feel like one of those slightly more mainstream, slightly more obvious appointments. And I don't know if you two were maybe as enthusiastic as I was when he sort of started being linked. Not to throw you in.
Yeah, I quite like him. I quite like him as a coach. I quite like a big part of the game it now is, and you see it by how forensically this season, and it's not just this season, it happened under Smith and probably Farker as well, how forensically managers get examined in terms of press conferences and what they say. And he is very personable. He is very good in press conferences. He feels to me like somebody who does build relationships. Did play for Ipswich Town, so that's an element, and how big that is for people, you have to decide. But yeah, as a coach, I mean, he was Wayne Rooney's assistant, wasn't he, at Derby, and was credited with a lot of what that side did, even though they inevitably got relegated. It was mainly credited to his coaching expertise that they were, which is maybe a little bit unfair on Rooney, but that was the narrative at the time as well. Didn't do quite as well when he stepped into the number one category. We are going to be wrapping up very, very soon. So any last comments, any last questions, get them in. If there's anything that we've missed, if there's anyone's name that you want to put into the frame, feel free to do so. And Adam will be monitoring those over the next 5 minutes. Paddy, it's going to be a big summer for Norwich City now, isn't it? I think, and we said this pre-game. I think we're probably expecting the retained and release list to emerge pretty quickly over the weekend now as well. I think we've seen Ben Gibson, Dimi Yanulis, Jakob Sørensen. I'd be surprised if any of those players who are out of contract remain at the club. So we're already talking about a big chunk of the squad being taken out, and there will obviously be cost reasons and footballing reasons behind that. This is now a significant rebuild for Norwich City, isn't it? You look at the job that they've got to do. New head coach, a lot of recruitment now as well, and that's before we maybe talk about some players that they might lose, they may have to lose for financial reasons. But even down to structurally, they need a new academy manager. There's lots of loose ends that need tying up. Boardroom as well in a very short period of time.
And that's an important point, and that's why post these, certainly the appointment of the head coach, the messaging now is so important, because with the greatest will in the world, you'd have to be something akin to a miracle worker to pull all that together and hit the ground running from August and be ready to go and have Norwich up and around it. I think this could be...
Well, that was going to be my question.
This could be a season or two job.
Yeah.
This could be stick with us. There'll be some short-term pain. We can't do everything in one window in terms of the squad dynamic. That's just not feasible to be able to refresh in one summer transfer window. But this is the way we're going to go. I think you'll enjoy the end process. Stick with us. As keep drawing the parallel with 17, where maybe in later years he wasn't quite as good at messaging, but he was very good at messaging in those early years. Stuart Webber, about this is what we're trying to do. There'll be a few bumps in the road, but we feel the end result will be worth it. And maybe you could debate it, but certainly those two championship title wins were worth it, and the style of football they played were worth it. The development of young talent, not only for Norwich's first team, but then subsequently to sell them for huge sums to reinvest, to facilitate a lot of the infrastructure work as well. So it is a big summer, but I think it's only the start, and I think that's so important if you're Ben Napa or whoever is public facing from the football club, the new incoming head coach. Don't try and sell this unrealistic vision that everything can come together and Norwich will be competing for automatic promotion, maybe not even for the top six, but if the messaging is consistent and you can start to see the processes being put in place and going back to Sam's point earlier about something more akin to what Norwich fans associate with Norwich, what they want to see from a Norwich team on the pitch. If there starts to be evidence of that, incremental evidence over the months ahead, then I think we could be in for another exciting phase, because, you know, the reality is this pragmatic lurching from season to season, quick fixes, trying to sort of cut corners, it's just not going to work. I think the longer term path to sustainability, particularly for a club like Norwich, even with an Atanasio group increasing their shareholding, isn't going to be throwing vast sums at it. It's going to have to come from organic, being very clever, astute, this maybe harnessing of data in informing all the decisions at every level of the business. That takes time, and that takes structures being put in place. And so, yes, I feel quite excited and optimistic now, subject to the incoming appointment. If it's Neil Warnock, maybe not. no offence, Neil, but
I think he's busy at
Steve
Brooks United, isn't he?
Yeah, but it does feel like we might be on the cusp of something quite fresh and optimistic, and I think we could all buy into that.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that point before we end the show with some more comments, I almost feel, and I can't speak, and I don't speak on behalf of Norwich fans, but I kind of feel like Norwich fans are ready now for that. They've kind of had this sticking plaster 2 years, so to speak, of short-termism, of lurching, as you say, of not really knowing what the club is or what they're even trying to do, maybe, and that's probably the messaging point. It does now feel like almost they're ready to fall in love with a character again, be that a head coach, group of players, and yeah, I think that is quite exciting, and people should be hopefully excited and infused by that ahead of next season. Adam, let's close with some more comments from the fine people watching across our platform.
So Jeffman98 on YouTube said, any idea if there'll be a post-season reflection presser, or will it be internal / not be one?
Paddy?
Funny enough, we asked the question last night. There is an expect. I mean, this is obviously overtaken by events.
Yeah.
But specifically Ben Napper, we did ask the question, and there was a sense that he would sit down, but it might be more once the dust has settled and forward thinking. Now, obviously, we roll it on a few hours. We might be seeing him on a top table at Car Road introducing a new head coach before long. But there was an expectation we would get that.
Yeah, and what I will say is we've nearly been going for an hour now. We've not, I don't think, really mentioned Leeds, so they've done really well to move this on already. Adam, let's come back to you.
Shaney NCFC on YouTube saying, with no parachute payments, do you feel concerned there could be a quick fire sale now?
Sam?
I think they will sell players because players will want to leave, and you know they're now. I mean, you know, as the
who do you look at? Who do you look at the top of that?
Sarah is the main one, isn't he? I mean, Sarah for me, there's a 99% chance he goes. Then, depending on interest, really, probably Rose, the next one, the next cab off the rank, and then throw Gunn and Sargent in there if there's sufficient interest as well. But you know, we know they've been operating because of the sort of complex financial situation and the loans that they took out. They've effectively been operating as if they don't have parachute payments for this season anyway. So that specifically won't affect things too much, I don't think. But the fact is that they are a championship club. If somebody comes and slaps 30 million on the table for Gabriel Sara, they're not really in a position to say no or to negotiate too hard. So I think there will be multiple key players leaving the club. But to be honest, you know, as frustrating as it can be for a football fan, that is the norm as a standard championship club, which is, you know, what Norwich are.
Let's have a few rapid fire comments and then we'll close it up.
UK Adventures in Orlando is asking, do you
advertising?
Do we have any sense of how Napper wants us to be as a club, our identity, etc.? I guess from that we know what sort of type of head coach he'll be looking for.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and we've touched upon that, I think, in terms of the data, and we can only take him in terms of the public utterances that we've got in terms of control and whatnot. So you would hope that there's some alignment there in terms of profile.
What's we got further down here? We have got, what did Danny Bath do so wrong?
Oh, that's harsh. Nothing majorly. I think he's just fallen down the pecking order, hasn't he? I think he's one that was brought in to fill a hole. He's filled a hole, and when he's played, he's I wouldn't say he's done anything massively wrong. He's not played too much to do anything massively wrong. So yeah, I think probably that will be reflected upon as part of maybe a weird signing of a weird era. So unless there's any other pressing comments, and you're shaking your head, which is good, I think we will leave it there. Thank you very much for bearing with us amid technological difficulties with the first broadcast. We've managed to successfully get through the second. It's obviously going to be an exciting summer of change for Norwich City. We're going to head back to the fine city, and we'll see you again very soon.